It was the summer of 1997 in Colorado, a season when the mountains were alive, with hikers, families, and groups of friends seeking adventure. Among them was a tight-knit group of 4 teenagers, friends since childhood, who set out for what was supposed to be a short weekend hike. They laughed as they packed their backpacks, slung water bottles over their shoulders, and told their parents they would be back before sunset. No one could have imagined that this ordinary day would mark the beginning of one of Colorado's most haunting mysteries. The trail they chose was not particularly dangerous. Locals hiked it often, and it was considered safe even for beginners. But by the next morning, panic spread across their small community. The teens never returned. Cars filled the trailhead parking lot. Search dogs were brought in, helicopters flew over the mountains, and volunteers combed the forest day and night. Yet after weeks of searching, there was nothing, no footprints, no scraps of clothing, not even a broken branch that could explain where they had gone. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. The families refused to give up hope. Year after year, anniversaries passed with candlelight vigils and desperate pleas for answers. The case turned cold, but the ache remained. And then 5 years later, something would be discovered beneath the soil. Something that would reopen the case and leave investigators stunned. But before that chilling moment, the mystery of those vanished teenagers would continue to hang over the Colorado mountains like a shadow. The summer of 1997 in Colorado was one filled with life. The trails in the Rockies were crowded with hikers, families, and groups of young people eager to enjoy the freedom of the outdoors. Among them was a close-knit group of 4 teenagers. Michael, 17, his younger sister Anna, 16, their friend Daniel, 17, and Sarah, 15. They had grown up together in the same neighborhood, bonded over years of shared memories, and now, with summer in full swing, they were ready for an adventure of their own. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. They packed their bags with snacks, water bottles, and sleeping bags, laughed as they argued over which trail mix was the best, and promised their families they would return the next afternoon. Their parents waved goodbye as they drove toward the mountains, unaware that this would be the last time they would see their children alive. The trail they chose, known locally as Pine Ridge, was not considered dangerous. It was marked and popular, used frequently by day hikers and campers. But by the following morning, panic began to spread. The teens hadn't returned. Calls went unanswered, and their families quickly notified authorities. What followed was one of the largest search efforts in the region's history. Teams of volunteers, local police, and rescue units scoured the trails. Helicopters hovered above the dense pine forests. Search dogs sniffed tirelessly through brush and creek beds. Flyers with the teenagers' faces were posted everywhere, on trees, telephone poles, and shop windows in nearby towns. Yet no matter how far or deep they searched, nothing was found. No discarded backpack, no footprints, not even a sign of struggle. It was as though the earth itself had opened and swallowed them. The community was shaken. Candlelight vigils were held, news stations broadcast the case nightly, and strangers traveled from other towns just to help search. But after weeks of exhausting efforts, the trail went cold. Authorities reluctantly pulled back their resources, leaving only grieving parents, unanswered questions, and a silence that felt heavier than the mountains themselves. For the families, time stood still. Birthdays and holidays became painful reminders of absence. Each year, the anniversaries were marked with tears, prayers, and desperate hope that somehow, the 4 would walk back through the front door. Some believed they had simply gotten lost. Others whispered of something darker lurking in the woods. The case officially went cold, but for those who lived through it, the mystery never faded. Parents clung to fading photographs, siblings carried the weight of not knowing, and the town carried the ache of a wound that never closed. And then 5 years later, shocking discovery buried beneath the soil would surface. It would not answer all the questions, but it would reopen the case and haunt everyone who remembered those vanished teenagers. In the days immediately following the disappearance, the atmosphere in the small Colorado town shifted from disbelief to sheer urgency. Parents who once thought their children were simply late coming home now faced a nightmare that stretched into endless days. News vans rolled into town, reporters crowded near the sheriff's office, and television anchors spoke of 4 teenagers who vanished without a trace. The sheriff's department organized search teams, and soon, hundreds of volunteers joined them. Neighbors who had watched the kids grow up strapped on hiking boots and carried flashlights. Helicopters flew in grid patterns across the forest canopy, their blades chopping through the quiet as spotlights scanned the ground below. At night, the mountains glowed faintly from the beams of searchlights and campfires of volunteers refusing to give up, yet nothing appeared. The trails looked untouched, as if the teenagers had never been there at all. Search dogs followed scents only to lose them abruptly in random clearings. Rangers retraced every possible detour, but each path ended the same way: silence. The lack of evidence became almost more disturbing than if there had been signs of struggle. It was as though nature itself had erased their presence. The media began speculating. Some claimed the teens had run away together, perhaps chasing adventure beyond the mountains. Others whispered about the possibility of foul play, an encounter with a stranger, or someone lying in wait deep in the forest. Rumors spread quickly, each one crueler than the last, but none provided real answers. Meanwhile, the families held on to hope. They set up a small headquarters near the trailhead, covering tables with maps, photographs, and pinned notes of possible leads. Mothers and fathers spoke directly to the cameras, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Their voices trembled, but their eyes burned with determination. Weeks turned into months. The once busy search site quieted down. Volunteers had jobs to return to. The media shifted to other headlines, and eventually the sheriff's office scaled back its operations. All leads exhausted, they said in their final report. For the town, and especially for the families, those words felt like a cruel surrender. Still, the pain refused to fade. The high school where the teens had studied kept their lockers untouched. Memorials of hope frozen in time. Friends left flowers, notes, and candles, refusing to let their memories die. For every person who tried to move on, another clung desperately to the belief that answers still lingered somewhere in the mountains. And so, the mystery sat heavy over the town, year after year. But then, in 2002, 5 long years after that fateful hike, an unexpected discovery would jolt the entire community back into the nightmare they thought had begun to settle. Something buried in the soil was unearthed, and it carried the weight of secrets no one was prepared to confront. It was a quiet autumn afternoon in 2002 when 2 local men decided to explore a section of the Colorado forest rarely visited. They weren't searching for clues, not really. They were outdoorsmen familiar with the mountains, drawn by the lure of untamed paths. But on this particular day, as one of them stumbled over uneven ground, his boot struck something hard just beneath the soil. At first he thought it was an old tree root or a buried rock. But when he brushed away the leaves and dirt, what emerged stopped him cold. It wasn't rock, it was fabric. Tangled, faded, and half-raiden. It looked like the strap of a backpack. The men crouched low, brushing away more earth with trembling hands. Soon, an entire outline of a buried object appeared. A backpack, weathered, torn, and caked with mud. Its zippers were rusted, its colors long faded, but it was unmistakable. This wasn't just any lost hiker's gear. This was something that could change everything. Authorities were immediately called. Deputies and forensic specialists arrived, carefully lifting the backpack from its shallow grave. They laid it out under the fading light of the day, documenting every detail. And there, stitched faintly on the inside flap, was a name that chilled everyone present. It belonged to one of the missing teenagers. Inside, the contents were heartbreaking. Old notebooks with warped pages, a cracked flashlight, a wallet with faded photographs, items so ordinary, yet now so extraordinary in what they meant. The teenagers had been here, they hadn't vanished into thin air. After all, something had happened to them, something terrible, and this backpack was the first undeniable proof in 5 years. News spread like wildfire. Reporters returned to the town, their vans once again lining the streets. Families who had waited half a decade crowded into the sheriff's office, desperate for answers. Was this proof their children had died? Or was it possible, against all odds, that one or more had survived and simply left this behind? Theories multiplied. Some believed the teens had been forced off the trail and deeper into the woods, where they met with disaster. Others whispered about human interference, someone leading them astray, only to silence them forever. Forensic teams scoured the surrounding area, digging deeper, scanning the soil for more evidence. But for days, nothing else surfaced. What haunted investigators most was the question of why. Why was the backpack buried? It hadn't simply been dropped or abandoned. Someone or something had taken the time to conceal it, and that detail alone changed the entire narrative. As the sun set over the mountains that autumn week, one thing was certain. The mystery was no longer a cold case of vanishing. It was now a puzzle of concealment, fear, and possibly violence. The backpack had been found, but the answers it raised were far more chilling than anyone expected. In the days following the discovery of the buried backpack, the quiet town near the Colorado mountains transformed into a hive of activity. Forensic tents popped up in the woods, marked by yellow police tape that fluttered in the mountain breeze. Teams of investigators with gloves and masks meticulously combed the area, determined to find even the smallest clue. To them, the backpack was not just an item, it was a silent witness that had been hidden in the soil for 5 long years. Specialists treated the discovery with the utmost care. The soil where it was found was sifted through, inch by inch. Forensic dogs were brought back to the scene, trained to detect human remains or traces of blood, but they found nothing conclusive. Some investigators believed that the area had already been disturbed by weather and wildlife over the years, erasing key evidence. Still, the fact that the backpack was buried suggested human involvement. Someone, at some point, had placed it there deliberately. The families of the missing teenagers were torn between relief and despair. Relief, because finally there was something tangible, proof that their children had been in those woods. Despair, because that proof also hinted at a darker fate. At a press conference, one of the mothers clutched her child's photograph tightly, tears streaming down her face, as she whispered into the cameras, "Why hide their things? Who would do this?" Her words echoed the questions that now haunted the entire community. The sheriff's department began retracing the old investigation from 1997, pulling out stacks of files, photographs, and witness statements. Detectives re-interviewed hikers who had been on the trail that summer, as well as locals who might have seen the teens before they vanished. They even reached out to former suspects, men who had once been questioned but never charged. One theory that resurfaced was the possibility of an encounter with someone dangerous, perhaps a recluse living in the woods, or even a transient passing through. Adding to the intrigue, searchers discovered something peculiar near the site of the backpack, an old fire pit, long abandoned, with charred remains of wood and bones. At first glance, the bones appeared to be from animals, possibly deer, but forensic testing was ordered immediately, just in case. The thought of human remains mixed with ash was enough to unsettle even the most seasoned investigators. Media outlets from across the country descended on the town once again, turning the case into national headlines. News anchors spoke of the Colorado mystery reignited, and speculated endlessly on what could have happened in those mountains. For the families, however, the constant attention felt like reopening an old wound, one that had never truly healed. The backpack had given them hope for answers, but as each day passed without further discoveries, that hope twisted into fear. What if this was all they would ever find? What if the mountains would forever keep their secret? As winter approached, investigators faced mounting pressure. The clock was ticking, and the silence of the forest loomed heavier than ever. The teens had vanished into those woods 5 years earlier, but now the question was no longer just where they had gone. It was who had made sure their story was buried. As autumn leaves blanketed the forest floor, the investigation into the buried backpack deepened. Detectives hoped that forensics would provide a breakthrough, but initial lab results only raised more questions. The backpack was worn but intact, its zippers still functional. Inside, they found several personal items: a crumpled notebook, a broken flashlight, a half-empty water bottle, and most haunting of all, a set of photographs. The images, faded and slightly damaged from years underground, showed the teenagers smiling, hiking along the trail, and posing together in front of a ridge. These were likely some of the last pictures ever taken of them, but something else stood out. Among the photographs of the friends was one peculiar picture. It was blurry, taken in low light, showing what seemed to be a figure in the background, half hidden among the trees. Some dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of shadows, but others wondered, had someone been following them that day? The idea sent a chill through the families and investigators alike. The notebook, too, offered unsettling hints. Though many of its pages were water-damaged and unreadable, a few fragments of writing remained legible. One entry read, "We think someone is out here. At night, we hear footsteps. Maybe it's just animals." Another line, written hastily, simply said, "We're not alone." These discoveries shifted the investigation into a new, darker direction. Detectives began considering whether the teens had encountered a stalker or a stranger while on the trail. Old reports of hermits and drifters living off the grid in the Colorado wilderness resurfaced. Locals recalled stories of odd men seen wandering the woods in the 1990s, keeping to themselves but occasionally frightening hikers. Could one of them have crossed paths with a group of teenagers? Meanwhile, the analysis of the fire pit near the backpack revealed a mix of animal bones, yet there were anomalies. Some fragments were too small and brittle to be immediately identified. Forensic teams kept testing, unwilling to rule out the possibility that human remains might have been among the ashes. The mere suggestion sent shockwaves through the town. As word spread about the photographs and the eerie notebook entries, the story captured national attention once more. Television specials debated the meaning of the blurred figure. Was it a person? Was it a shadow? Some viewers insisted they saw the outline of a man, while skeptics argued it was nothing more than distortion. For the families, these findings were agonizing. The evidence suggested their children had been afraid, aware that something or someone was near them. The idea that the teens' final moments were filled with fear was almost unbearable to accept. Despite the heartbreak, the discovery gave investigators renewed determination. Search teams expanded their grid, probing deeper into the forest, guided by the hope that if one item had been buried, perhaps more clues remained hidden. And then, just when it seemed the trail had gone cold again, a discovery would emerge that was even more disturbing than the backpack. Something buried deeper in the soil, something that hinted at a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. The following spring, the search resumed in an area just a few miles from where the backpack had been unearthed. This time, investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan beneath the surface, hoping to detect disturbances in the soil that might indicate buried objects. For days, the machine beeped over rocks, roots, and hardened earth until one reading caught their attention. A patch of ground showed irregularities consistent with something unnatural beneath it. With careful hands, the team began digging. At first, they uncovered nothing but layers of compacted soil. Then, about 3 feet down, they struck wood. It appeared to be the remains of a crude box or container, its planks rotting from years underground. As they pried it open, the investigators froze. Inside lay a bundle of clothing torn, faded, and unmistakably from the 1990s. Among the items was a denim jacket, eerily similar to one remembered by the family of one of the missing boys. Next to it lay a pair of sneakers, the brand and style matching those worn by another teen. The clothing was damp, stained, and partially decomposed, but the discovery left no doubt. This was connected to the vanished friends. But the most disturbing find was not the clothes. At the bottom of the wooden box was a small, rusted knife, its blade still sharp despite years of corrosion. The handle bore scratches, as if it had been gripped tightly in moments of desperation. Forensic testing would later reveal faint traces of blood embedded in the metal, though it was too degraded to confirm whose it was. The discovery reignited media coverage, and speculation ran wild. Had the teenagers been attacked? Had they stumbled upon someone's hidden shelter in the forest? Some investigators theorized the box had been deliberately buried to conceal evidence, perhaps by someone who knew exactly what had happened to the teens. The families, once again, were torn between relief and devastation. Relief, because the items finally provided tangible proof that their children had been there. Devastation, because these discoveries suggested violence rather than accident. In the nearby town, old rumors resurfaced. Residents whispered about a mysterious man seen in the mountains during the late 1990s. An outsider who kept to himself, rarely came into town, and vanished shortly after the teens disappeared. Could he have been involved? Or was it possible the friends had crossed paths with someone else, someone who didn't want to be found? For detectives, the box represented both progress and frustration. It was evidence, yes, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why bury the clothes and the knife separately from the backpack? Why not hide everything together? The deliberate concealment suggested a methodical mind, someone who wanted to control the narrative of what was left behind. And just as the investigation reached this new height of tension, another chilling detail emerged. One of the remaining notebook pages, preserved in the backpack, contained a line scrawled hastily across the margin. It read, "If we don't make it back, tell them we saw him." The question now loomed larger than ever: who was him? The words scribbled in the notebook, "Tell them we saw him," became the turning point of the entire case. Investigators, journalists, and family members obsessed over that single line. Who was him? Why had the teens felt it was important to leave such a message, even in the midst of fear and uncertainty? Detectives re-examined the original witness statements from 1997. In the days leading up to the hike, a handful of locals reported seeing a man camping alone in the nearby forest. He was described as tall, wiry, with a beard that made him look older than he probably was. Some said he carried an axe, though others insisted it was just a walking stick. He never gave his name. He bought canned food from a general store in town, paid in cash, and then disappeared into the wilderness. The timing aligned disturbingly well. That summer was the last time anyone had seen the group of teens alive, and shortly afterward, the strange man was never spotted again. Investigators began to suspect that the teens might have crossed paths with him during their hike. Could he have been living in a hidden shelter in the woods? The same woods where the box of clothes and knife had been buried? As the press latched onto this theory, locals who had been children at the time came forward with haunting recollections. One woman recalled her father warning her not to play near the trail because a dangerous man had been seen there. Another remembered her older brother claiming he had seen smoke rising from a part of the forest no one used for camping. These scattered memories only deepened the mystery. Forensics tried to glean more from the evidence. The knife's handle was tested again with newer technology, and while no usable fingerprints were found, the lab did uncover traces of soil that didn't match the spot where the box had been buried. This meant the items had likely been moved buried elsewhere first, then relocated later. Whoever had done this was organized and cautious, aware of how to avoid leaving obvious clues. Meanwhile, the notebook itself provided more fragments of insight. Several pages before the final chilling line, one of the teens had written about feeling watched. On another page, a crude drawing showed a figure standing among trees, with the words "he's out there" scrawled underneath. Investigators could not determine whether these entries were meant literally or were simply the nervous musings of teenagers alone in the woods. For the families, each new detail was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it proved their children had left behind clues, whispers from the past. On the other, it suggested their final moments were filled with fear, stalked by someone unseen. The town grew restless with speculation. Some argued the man was just a harmless drifter, unfairly turned into a villain. Others were convinced he was responsible, a predator who had chosen his victims carefully. The mystery now seemed to hinge on one haunting question. If the teens saw him, why had no one else ever found him? And if he was real, had he vanished into the mountains along with the answers? Investigators turned their focus back to the cabin, deep in the Colorado woods, the same hidden structure that explorers had stumbled upon years after the teens vanished. At first glance, the cabin had seemed like a decaying shelter, barely holding itself together. But now, With the new evidence pointing to a mysterious man in the forest, detectives began to wonder if the place had been more than just an abandoned hideout. Teams combed through the photographs taken inside the cabin. Dusty shelves, broken furniture, and scraps of fabric littered the floor. But in the corner, half concealed under fallen beams, was something overlooked in the initial sweep: a rusted lantern and a tin can with faded labels. Identical to the brand sold in the local store back in 1997, the same store where witnesses claimed the bearded man had purchased supplies. This detail sent shivers down the spine of the investigators. Could this have been his shelter all along? When forensic teams returned to the cabin with modern technology, they discovered faint carvings etched into one of the wooden walls. At first they looked like random scratches, but closer inspection revealed shapes stillies, as if someone had been keeping track of days. Roughly 30 marks were counted, but then they abruptly stopped. No names, no explanations, just silence. Locals who had grown up hearing whispers about the missing teens started to speculate wildly. Some said the cabin had been a hunting outpost long before the 1980s. Others believed it had been purposely hidden by someone who didn't want to be found. Rumors swirled about survivalists, fugitives, and even reclusive mountain men who might have called the wilderness home. The families of the missing teenagers were torn apart by these new developments. For some, the discovery of the cabin connected too many dots to ignore. They believed with certainty that their children had encountered this strange man, perhaps near that very shelter. For others, the evidence felt frustratingly vague, mere coincidences that failed to answer the only question that mattered: what really happened to the four friends? The press sensationalized the findings. Headlines screamed about a ghost in the woods, a phantom figure who vanished as suddenly as he appeared. Television programs speculated whether the man had been responsible for other disappearances in the region, tying unrelated cold cases together under a single, chilling theory. Behind the scenes, detectives pressed forward. They scoured missing persons records from the 1990s, searching for anyone who might match the man's description. A handful of names: surface drifters, men estranged from their families, one even suspected of violent crimes. But none could be conclusively tied to the Colorado mountains. The elusive figure remained as much a mystery as the teens themselves. By this stage, the investigation was no longer just about what had happened. It became about who might still be out there. Was the cabin a relic of someone who had vanished decades ago? Or was the man still alive, hiding in the mountains, watching as investigators chased shadows? And with that chilling possibility, unease settled once more over the town. Because if he was still out there, the mountains might not have given up all their secrets yet. By the early 2000s, the mystery of the missing Colorado teenagers had taken on a life of its own. The families, though weary from years of unanswered questions, pushed investigators to continue searching. And then came a discovery that reignited the entire case. While conducting a survey of the forest trails for potential camping development, a group of workers stumbled upon an area of disturbed soil not far from the cabin. It didn't look recent, it was subtle, the kind of ground shift that comes with years of erosion, but something about it seemed unnatural. When the workers dug carefully, they uncovered fragments of a backpack buried beneath the earth. The backpack was weathered, its fabric torn, the colors faded almost to nothing. But inside, protected by layers of dirt, were belongings that had miraculously survived. There was a cracked cassette player, a water bottle with a faded sticker, and, most haunting of all, a student ID card with the photograph of one of the missing teens. After 5 long years of silence, there was finally physical proof that they had been there. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Families rushed to the site, clinging to the hope that more answers would soon follow. For investigators, the backpack confirmed a chilling reality. The teens had never left the mountains. They had vanished within them. But the evidence raised more questions than it answered. Why was the backpack buried? Who placed it there and why? Investigators considered whether the teens had tried to hide their belongings, perhaps in fear of someone they encountered. Others believed it was the work of the mysterious man, concealing any trace of the group after something terrible had happened. The soil around the site was combed inch by inch. Forensic teams unearthed scraps of fabric, shoe fragments, and a rusted pot knife. Yet there were no bones, no bodies, nothing that could provide closure. It was as if the earth itself had chosen to guard its secrets. Speculation gripped the town once more. Some whispered about foul play, imagining the figure of the man in the woods, carefully burying what he could not carry away. Others believed the teens had encountered something tragic, an accident, a fall, or exposure, and that animals or nature itself had scattered their remains. The backpack, they said, was just what the forest allowed to be found. The families were torn apart by the discovery. Holding the ID card was like holding a piece of their loved one again, yet it was also a cruel reminder of the years lost. Candlelight vigils turned somber, filled with both gratitude for the clue and despair for the unanswered questions it brought. Investigators vowed to keep digging, but as days turned into weeks, the trail once again went cold. The forest remained silent, refusing to reveal the truth all at once. The backpack had been uncovered, but the story behind it was still locked away in the soil, waiting for one final revelation. The discovery of the buried backpack might have been the key to unlocking the mystery, but it was not the end of the story. For investigators, it became a renewed starting point, a final attempt to piece together what had happened to the 4 teenagers who vanished in the Colorado mountains in 1997. Months after the backpack was found, a team of volunteer explorers decided to search deeper into the forest, beyond where official investigators had focused. Their determination led them to a remote ravine, overgrown with thick vegetation. There, nestled between boulders, they noticed what looked like a shallow cave. Inside, they found something that silenced everyone: a tattered jacket, unmistakably from the late 1990s, with bones scattered around it. Forensic testing confirmed the worst fears. The remains belonged to 2 of the missing teenagers. Alongside them, a rusted flashlight and another fragment of a backpack were uncovered. The finding brought both heartbreak and clarity. After years of uncertainty, 2 families finally knew the fate of their children, but the case still held shadows. Where were the other 2 teens, and what had happened in those final hours? Forensic experts examined the bones and clothing. There were no signs of violent trauma, no stab wounds, no bullet holes suggesting that the cause of death may have been exposure, starvation, or perhaps even a fall while trying to escape. The eerie detail that haunted investigators was the distance between the cave and where the first backpack was buried. The placement of belongings suggested intent. Someone had moved or hidden items deliberately. But who? The mysterious man reported in the early days of the search became the focus once again. Yet no trace of him was ever found. The surviving families clung to their hope that the other 2 friends might one day be found. Every discovery seemed to provide answers while deepening the mystery at the same time. Memorials were held near the trailhead, where photographs of the teenagers were placed beneath tall pine trees, surrounded by candles and handwritten notes. Local residents spoke of the case for years after. Some believed the group had been stalked by someone who knew the terrain, someone who forced them into the cave before nature took its toll. Others believed the group became lost, panicked, and tried to separate, an act that led to tragedy. What is certain is that the Colorado mountains kept their secret for far too long. The discovery of the remains, the buried backpack, and the personal belongings served as a painful reminder that the wilderness can both preserve and conceal. Today, hikers who pass through the area see a small plaque dedicated to the teenagers, a symbol of both remembrance and warning. The mystery of exactly what happened may never be fully solved, but the echoes of their laughter, their final hike, and the long years of unanswered questions will never be forgotten. The mountains, after all, have stories of their own, and some are never meant to be fully told.